Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! What is this? What is this? My boy!
You've lost my boy.
It is not all.
She had once stood where no other woman dared, her fingers brushing against the golden crown of England, her eyes lifted to meet the cheers of thousands, her heart trembling, not from fear, but from triumph. She was Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, the woman for whom a king broke with Rome, severed his nation from the Pope, and rewrote the laws of marriage and succession. She had danced in the corridors of power, outwitted ambassadors, captured the attention of Europe, and birthed a daughter who would one day become a legend. But in the spring of the year 1536, all of it, every jewel, every whisper of admiration, every promise made in candlelight was crumbling under her feet in just 17 days. Anne Boleyn went from the most powerful woman in the kingdom to a condemned traitor, and the man who had once moved heaven and earth to possess her became the very architect of her death. It began with a fall not hers, but his, Henry VIII. The king who had once been England's golden lion, crashed to the ground during a joust, his leg shattered, his pride wounded, his mood darkening into something cruel and unstable. The injury would never heal. It would fester and throb and poison him for the rest of his life, twisting his flesh and his thoughts into something dangerous. On the very same day, January the 29th, Anne lost the baby inside her, a son. Witnesses whispered, and with that child went the last thread, binding her to the king's favor. She was not just a wife now, she was a disappointment, a failed investment, a woman who had not delivered what the Tudor dynasty craved most, a male heir. By February, a new face had appeared at court, pale, soft-spoken, and cunning. Jane Seymour stood where Anne had once stood beside the king, smiling sweetly, pretending to be above ambition. But behind her demure eyes burned calculation. And behind her stood the Seymour family, ready to rise as the Boleyns fell. Henry was enchanted, and Anne, she was still queen, still dressed in French velvet and black pearls, still holding court in grand halls, lined with tapestries of lovers and knights. But her power was already bleeding away. Silently, like a wound no one could see. In the shadows, another man moved. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, a master of secrets, had once allied with Anne to reform the church, to dissolve the monasteries, to reshape England itself. But now they were enemies. Anne challenged his policies, undermined his plans, and whispered against him in Henry's ear. Cromwell knew what he had to do, not remove her politically, but erase her completely. With icy precision, he set the trap. He planted spies among her ladies, gathered rumors like weapons, and waited. And then, in late April, everything accelerated. A court musician named Mark Smeaton was taken questioned, pressured, and perhaps tortured. He confessed to sleeping with the Queen. His words, likely torn from him by fear or pain, were enough. They didn't need truth, they needed permission to destroy. On May the 1st, the May Day joust began, a festival of spring, full of music, armor, and cheers. Henry and Anne sat together in the royal stands, pretending nothing had changed. But halfway through the tournament, a messenger handed the king a note. His face turned pale. He stood. He left. He didn't speak to Anne. He didn't look back. He took only Henry Norris, his closest friend who would be dead within the week. The next day, Anne was summoned. Not invited. Summoned. She walked through Greenwich Palace, the same halls where she had once ruled with a confident smile, and entered a room where three men waited. One of them was her uncle. They read the charges: adultery, treason, incest. Her brother's name was on the list. Her friends, her companions, her face, once flushed with royal power. I went pale. She begged to see the king. She was denied. Hours later, she was taken by barge down the Thames, past the same riverbanks that had once roared with cheers during her coronation. No music played now. No flags waved. The water was quiet. The sky gray. The oars slicing through silence. She stepped ashore at the Tower of London. Her legs shook. She looked at the great stone walls and whispered, "Jesus, have mercy on me." And then she asked, "Shall I die without justice?" The door closed behind her. For the next 17 days, Anne lived between hope and horror. Her daughter Elizabeth was only 2 years old. Her enemies were everywhere. Her allies were silent. One by one, 5 men were arrested. One by one, they were accused of loving her, of betraying the king, of crimes no one could prove. And then came the trial, a performance for 2,000 spectators. Her own uncle led the court. No evidence was shown, only words, only fear. 27 nobles rose and said guilty. On May the 17th, the 5 men were beheaded. Anne heard the cannon fire that signaled their deaths. Her brother was among them. That same day, her marriage was annulled, declared invalid, as if it had never existed. Her daughter became a bastard. Her crown disappeared. And 2 days later, Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, placed her head on the executioner's block. A French swordsman, imported for mercy, stood over her. She wore a simple gown. She prayed, and then it was over. But her death was not the end of the story, because from the ashes of her fall rose a queen greater than any before Elizabeth I, because the king who had tried to erase her instead immortalized her, because her trial revealed the terrifying truth of Tudor power that love meant nothing when ambition spoke louder, and because Anne Boleyn's final whisper, "The king has been very good to me. He raised me from nothing to be queen. And now he will raise me to be a martyr," still echoes through history. It was the kind of winter morning that England often wears without pride, damp and grey, with fog rolling low across the Thames, and the wind dragging the scent of smoke from the hearths of noble houses and the hovels of fishermen alike. Inside Greenwich Palace, beneath vaulted ceilings and golden beams dulled by time, Queen Anne Boleyn was not awake to the world outside. She lay in her bed, the air around her heavy with rosewater and despair, her body weakened from blood loss and pain, her eyes distant and dry, as if they had already wept too much. It was the 29th day of January in the year 1536, and something precious had been lost. A child, a boy, the son that might have saved her life, the son that might have secured her crown, the son that might have given England peace. They had not wrapped him in silk, nor given him a name, for he had not drawn breath, but Anne had felt him, known him, dreamed of him for months. And now, her body empty and aching, she stared at the canopy above her with a hollow quiet that frightened even the most experienced of her ladies. No one spoke unless she asked. No one dared bring news from the court. And yet, news found its way to her, anyway, drifting like poison under the door, whispered by servants who forgot to lower their voices. The king, it was said, had fallen during a joust only days before. Not merely fallen, but struck violently. so that for hours no one knew whether he would wake again. His leg crushed. His pride shattered. He had lain still, unmoving, pâle. And when at last he stirred, it was with a groan that sounded more like rage than relief. Anne had collapsed the moment she heard it. Some said the miscarriage came from grief. Others whispered it was fear. But perhaps it was something deeper, a soul breaking from pressure too great to bear. A heart cracking beneath a love that had turned to ice. And while she mourned in silence, something else began to stir in the shadows beyond her chamber walls. Jane Seymour, pale and quiet, modest in manner, but not in ambition, had begun to appear more frequently at court, a lady in waiting. Yes, but not just any lady. She was soft where Anne was sharp, obedient where Anne was willful, demure where Anne was fire. And it was exactly that difference which began to soothe the king's wounded pride. Jane's eyes lowered when he approached. Her voice was gentle. She did not argue. She did not laugh too loudly. She let him believe he was wise and brave and strong, even as his leg throbbed with rot and his crown sat heavier than ever before. It was Anne's misfortune to see what was happening and be powerless to stop it. Still weak from childbirth and haunted by the memory of tiny fingers she would never hold. She rose from her bed with trembling limbs and resumed her place as queen at mass, at banquet, at courtly entertainments. But no longer did the king seek her gaze across the room. No longer did he reach for her hand beneath the table. No longer did his eyes soften when she smiled. Instead, he watched Jane, and Jane, with the patience of a viper, waited. There were moments quiet, private moments when Anne tried to speak to Henry of their daughter, Elizabeth, of their past, of what they had sacrificed for each other. She reminded him how he had once called her his most dear and sweet love, how he had waited 7 long years to have her, how he had risked the wrath of Christendom to call her queen. But Henry, now almost 44 years old, no longer lived in memory. He lived in the ache of his leg and the absence of a male heir. And where once he saw Anne's eyes as enchanting, now he saw them as defiant. Where once he admired her wit, now he called it insolence. And where once he treasured her courage, now he called it pride. She had no one to confide in. Her father, cold and ambitious, spoke more to survive than to support. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had always considered her rise to be too quick, too bold, too threatening, and the women around her, once allies, now listened more than they comforted. Their eyes shifting, their loyalty fading. She felt it like a change in the wind, something cold brushing against her skin when no window was open. By the time March crept into court, with its muddy boots and hesitant son, Anne had begun to feel the walls closing in. The king met with his counselors behind locked doors. Cromwell no longer visited her chambers with reports. Messages were sent and received without her knowledge. Jane's presence grew, not only in rumor but in fact. The king gifted her a locket. He gave her his portrait. And Anne, though still queen, it began to feel like a ghost walking through a palace, built from paper. And then, one night, she dreamed of her son. In the dream, he had Henry's eyes and her dark hair. He laughed once and then vanished into the mist. When she awoke, her pillow was soaked with tears, her hands clenched in the sheets, her breath shallow with grief. She did not speak of it. There was no one left who would care. Outside her chamber, England turned. The people still bowed when she passed, but their eyes were uncertain. The clergy still addressed her as Your Majesty. But their sermons grew colder, and somewhere in the echoing corridors of Whitehall, Thomas Cromwell sat at a table lined with parchment, arranging names, planning futures, deciding which truths would survive and which lies would kill. Henry did not visit Anne again that month. He was often with Jane now. He called her his true comfort. And Anne, for all her brilliance, I could not find the words to make him remember who she was, or why he had once loved her so fiercely. But even then, even as her crown began to tilt, she held her head high. She dressed in her finest gowns, draped in black velvet and purple silk, with gold threads sewn by hand. She greeted ambassadors. She walked the long halls without trembling, and though her eyes betrayed the storm inside, her voice remained steady, for she was a queen, and she would not fall without dignity. Not yet. There are silences in a palace that speak louder than bells. Silences that linger in corners, like forgotten prayers. That brush the back of your neck when no one is behind you. That creep into the folds of your gown and whisper warnings your heart is not ready to hear. In the spring of the year, 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn began to feel the weight of those silences pressing in from all sides, not with sudden violence, but with the slow, methodical certainty of something already decided. The halls she once ruled with wit and laughter began to feel like stage sets waiting for the curtain to fall. The smiles that once greeted her with warmth now curled too quickly or disappeared the moment she passed. Her ladies, once loyal, spoke in clipped tones and kept their eyes lowered for too long or not at all. There were new faces among them placed there. She would later learn not to serve her, but to observe her, watch her, report her, and beneath it all, the shadow of Thomas Cromwell stretched longer by the day. He did not confront her. That was not his way. He was not a man of swordplay or shouts, but of paper and ink, of plans laid months in advance, of traps disguised as justice. From his offices, he dispatched quiet men with quiet eyes who took note of who Anne spoke to, how long she laughed, what jokes she made, and to whom. In a world where one glance could be twisted into guilt, Anne was no longer safe, not in her chapel, not in her chambers, not even in her private thoughts. What she believed were harmless conversations, gentle banter, or clever retorts began to take shape in the minds of those around her as threads in a noose. But Anne, proud and defiant, still walked as queen. Her gown still shimmered in deep purples and dark golds. Her head held high, her words as sharp and swift as ever. She did not bow to suspicion. She did not hide from whispers. If anything, she leaned into her role with even greater majesty, determined to remind the court and herself that her crown had been earned not by birthright, but by fire. Still, something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the guards no longer met her eyes, in the way the musicians no longer played her favorite songs without prompting, in the way Jane Seymour began to appear at court with greater frequency and greater favor. Jane, soft-spoken and silver-skinned, had perfected the art of absence, present enough to be noticed, quiet enough to be unthreatening. She made herself small, where Anne had made herself blaze. And in doing so, she became a mirror, reflecting back to Henry everything Anne no longer was. In the long shadows of the corridors, Anne sometimes glimpsed Jane standing still, lips barely smiling, as if she already saw the crown coming toward her and only needed to wait a little longer. And Henry, once full of letters and longing, had grown cold, like embers under ash. He was often absent now, retreating into his own counsels, avoiding Anne's gaze even when they shared the same room. When he spoke, it was in clipped commands or careful formalities. And though his body still bore the crown, his heart was clearly wandering elsewhere. It was in this atmosphere of half-spoken sentences and unspoken verdicts that the real work began: the gathering of charges, the forging of narratives, the slow stitching of lies into something that resembled truth. Cromwell began to move with increasing speed. On the 24th day of April, commissions were quietly formed, legal instruments of immense power, under the old name Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. These commissions were designed for cases of treason. But no names were mentioned yet. No crimes announced. The stage was being set before the play was written, and it would be performed with the blood of a queen. The women in Anne's household, unaware or unwilling, and spoke freely enough when asked the right questions in the right tone. Did the queen ever flirt? Did she ever favor one man above others? Did she laugh at things no lady should laugh at? Did she speak of the king's affections waning? Did she ever mention Henry Norris? What of Mark Smeaton, George Boleyn, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton? Their words, small and scattered, were gathered like dry straw, and Cromwell would soon strike the match. But even as the walls closed in, Anne did not break. She could feel the tension in the air. She could hear the sounds that didn't belong, the shuffling just outside her doors at night, the pauses in conversations when she entered, the way even her most trusted ladies now excused themselves early. Yet she still stood tall at banquets. It still hosted court with the practiced smile of a woman who had survived worse and knew how to wear armor beneath silk. Perhaps she believed she could outlast the storm. Perhaps she believed that Henry, her Henry, would never allow her to fall. Perhaps she did not yet understand that the man who once loved her had become a stranger, capable of silence in the face of cruelty. In those last days of April, as the wind warmed and the gardens began to bloom again, the court prepared for the annual May Day festivities, a time of celebration, of tournaments and flowers and courtly play. But beneath the petals and the pageantry, something darker bloomed, something planned with careful cruelty and dressed in the clothes of tradition. The king would ride, the queen would watch, the knights would clash in choreographed battle, and then the world would change. Because while Anne selected her gown and prepared for the spectacle, Cromwell summoned Mark Smeaton, the young musician who had played lute in her chambers, who had sung softly at court, whose rise had come not through birth, but through talent. He was 24 years old, and he was about to be broken. What happened behind those doors will never be fully known. Some say he was tortured. Others say he was promised mercy. But what is recorded is this: Mark Smeaton confessed to adultery with the queen, a crime punishable by death, a lie that would become the cornerstone of everything that followed. And still, as the month drew to a close, Anne did not know. She stood by her window, perhaps, looking out at the river as it shimmered beneath the setting sun, unaware that her name had already been written on the parchment of doom, that her household was being watched, that her words were being twisted, that the eyes in the shadows no longer belonged to allies, but to those who would ensure her silence. The wind stirred the curtains. Somewhere in the palace, a door closed too quietly, and the trap, patient and precise, began to close. It was the final day of April in the year 1536, when the sound of quiet footsteps echoed across the polished floors of Stepney. No guards marched in unison, no trumpets signaled arrival, no official decree was read aloud. Instead, in the hush of late afternoon, the door to Thomas Cromwell's residence opened, and a young man with calloused fingers and nervous eyes stepped inside. His name was Mark Smeaton, and though he wore no noble title, he had risen through music to a place close enough to the Queen to be noticed, and now, close enough to be destroyed. He had been summoned politely, perhaps even with a smile, a request to speak, a question about court entertainment, an inquiry into palace matters. He was not under arrest, not yet, and yet when the door closed behind him, something final seemed to shift in the air. Perhaps he knew it then, or perhaps only later. When the pain came, no one saw what happened in that room. No scribe wrote down the conversation. No priest bore witness, but what emerged from that closed chamber was a confession, a sentence dressed as truth, a story carved into existence under duress. Mark Smeaton, just 24 years of age, admitted to the gravest of crimes, adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. They said he looked pale when he left, that his hands trembled, that he did not speak as he passed through the corridor, that his eyes, once filled with light when he played the lute in the royal gallery, now stared downward as if ashamed. Some whispered that the rack had been used. Others believed it was something quieter, ropes wound tight across his skull, words twisted into threats, promises of mercy for cooperation. The terror of being a commoner accused of touching a queen. Whatever was done, whatever was said, whatever pressure broke him, the damage was complete. The confession was enough. It was not evidence. It was not proof. But it was enough to set the machinery in motion, and in the darkness behind this carefully orchestrated moment, men were already waiting. Thomas Cromwell, always a step ahead, wasted no time. On the first day of May, as court prepared for the traditional May Day joust, the palace filled with pageantry, silk banners flapping in the wind, and noblemen in glittering armor, ready to perform chivalry before the king and queen. And another kind of performance was underway, one of silence, of glances exchanged across crowded chambers, of messages handed to riders who galloped through the streets, their satchels holding ruin disguised as law. Anne, dressed in dark crimson trimmed with gold, watched from the royal stand beside her husband, her face calm, her bearing regal, her hands folded delicately in her lap. The people cheered. Knights thundered forward with lances. Flowers rained from balconies. And yet, amidst all the joy and clamor, there was a tension behind Henry's eyes that no one could quite name. A flicker of something cold beneath the polished smile. He turned to her only briefly. And when he did, his gaze did not linger. Then came the moment, small, silent, unforgettable. A messenger approached the king, bowing low, a parchment folded in his hand. Henry took it. Read. And without a word, without ceremony, without farewell, without explanation, he stood and walked away. He did not speak to Anne. He did not look back. He took only one man with him, Henry Norris, groom of the stool, his closest friend. The court fell into stunned stillness. Whispers rippled like wind over water. Anne remained alone in the royal box, surrounded by the crowd, yet entirely isolated, as though the space around her had turned to glass. She did not rise. She did not flee. She sat, composed, perhaps sensing at last that something was coming. Not jealousy, not insult, something deeper, something final. By nightfall, Norris had been questioned. By morning, he would be imprisoned, and by the afternoon of the second day of May, the Queen herself would be summoned, not with grace, but with force. The King's Privy Council delivered the summons personally, Anne was watching a game of real tennis when the door opened. A man bowed, respectfully, but stiffly, and informed her that the king's council required her presence. No one else spoke. The room fell still. She stood slowly, adjusting her hood, her fingers pausing at her temple, as though calming a sudden storm behind her eyes. Her ladies trailed behind her like shadows. They passed through the corridors of Greenwich Palace, corridors where Anne had once danced, laughed, ruled until they reached the council chamber. Inside waited 3 men. One of them was her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. His face was stone. William Fitzwilliam and William Paulet stood beside him, not as courtiers, but as officers of the crown. There was no throne, no gesture of welcome, only the air of something being dismantled. They read the charges: adultery, treason, conspiracy against the king. Names were spoken aloud: Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, George Boleyn. More would follow. The words hung in the room like smoke. And Anne, stunned, tried to speak. Witnesses later described her reaction as something between horror and disbelief, her voice rising with confusion, her hands shaking, her eyes darting from one stony face to another. She denied it all. Of course she did. She demanded to speak with the king, to face her husband, to defend herself with truth. But the room remained deaf. She was told of Smeaton's confession. She was told of Norris's arrest. And when she asked, "Who accuses me?" no answer came that she could understand. She was escorted back to her chambers, told to wait. There, alone, she paced. Perhaps she prayed. Perhaps she clutched the arms of her chair and stared into the fire. Her thoughts racing across every moment. She had laughed with a man, spoken freely, leaned too close. Had she let her tongue run too quickly? Had her French manners betrayed her? Had she, in the comfort of courtly games, given her enemies what they needed? Her mind must have twisted into knots, reliving dinners, dances, whispers, her ladies, silent and grim. I could offer no comfort. Nothing made sense. Nothing aligned with justice. But the air was changing. And then, just after the tide turned on the River Thames, the guards returned. They did not speak. They simply bowed and led her down the stone steps to the royal barge. There would be no trial today. No defense. Only a journey. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was taken once more to the Tower of London. But this time, the trumpets did not play, and the only music was the slow splash of oars in grey water, carrying her not toward glory, but toward fate. There are moments in history when the world appears unchanged on the surface, when sunlight warms stone walls, just as it always has. When trumpets sound the same ceremonial notes as they did the year before. When lances lower, oaths pound, silk flags dance in the wind, and yet, beneath all that splendor, something has already broken. Something invisible and irreversible is sliding into place. Such was the 1st of May in the year 1536. A morning where England dressed herself in garlands and armor, in song and pageantry, in ribbons and rituals meant to echo spring. But beneath the gold and crimson, a queen's fate was quietly folding into shadow. At Greenwich Palace, preparations began early, as they always had. Servants moved through the great halls, brushing the dust from tapestries, laying out silver goblets, arranging benches for the crowd. Horses were led into the jousting field, their bridles polished, their flanks gleaming. The king's colors were raised high, his banners sewn with lions and fleurs de lis. and the crowds gathered with voices full of celebration, unaware that within hours, the air would hang heavy with something much colder than May. Anne Boleyn dressed carefully that morning. Her gown was of deep crimson velvet lined in ermine, a subtle nod to royalty but edged with restraint. She wore no crown, only a French hood stitched with black pearls. Her expression, as she stepped into the viewing box beside the king, was poised but distant, as though she had rehearsed serenity the way one rehearses a speech before it must be given to those who will not listen. Beside her sat Henry VIII, larger than he once had been, slower, his face still bearing the traces of the accident that had changed his body, and, some whispered, his soul. He wore ceremonial armor, though he would not ride. His leg throbbed beneath its layers. His face was unreadable, sculpted into the mask of a king, playing his part in a pageant designed for appearances. And around them, nobles cheered. Children waved sprigs of hawthorn, and the first knights took their places in the field. Among those knights was Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool, a man closer to the king than any save his own blood. He had once stood at the monarch's bedside in the quiet hours of night. He had known his moods, his pain, his laughter, and now, like Anne, he too rode into history's crosshairs with no sword drawn. The joust began. Lances splintered. Helmets gleamed beneath the sun. The crowd roared with approval as tradition unfolded like a tapestry before them. Rich in motion and noise, Anne applauded softly, her gloved hands barely making sound. She smiled when others smiled. She spoke when it was expected. But beneath her composure, her thoughts must have wandered. For she knew that Mark Smeaton had disappeared, that Norris had been questioned, that something sour was blooming beneath the perfume of politics. And then it happened. A messenger, dressed in the king's livery, approached from behind. He did not speak to Anne. He did not bow to her. He went directly to the king, a folded parchment in hand, a gesture practiced 100 times before, but never with such weight. Henry took the message, his eyes scanning its contents quickly, but not carelessly. His fingers clenched. Something shifted in him. Witnesses would later say his expression froze, that his color changed, that his jaw stiffened, and then without a single word, without ceremony, without explanation, he stood and left the royal box. Anne turned to him, but he did not look back. He did not take her hand. He did not pause. He left the celebration with only one man at his side, Henry Norris. The crowd, confused, watched as their king walked away from the May Day joust, his guards following close behind, their faces unreadable. A strange hush fell over the field, a silence unfit for festival, a pause too long to be unnoticed. The trumpets did not call for the next round. The music faltered. Anne remained seated alone in the place reserved for queens, her hands resting still in her lap, her face tilted ever so slightly downward, as though listening for a sound no one else could hear. And in that moment, the entire court saw it, not the fall of a queen, but the isolation of a woman who had once commanded kings and cardinals, now left exposed beneath the bright sky of spring. She did not rise. She did not weep, but something inside her, something long held and fiercely guarded, began to bend. When the joust resumed, it did so without joy. Whispers took the place of cheers. Eyes shifted. Rumors flickered like candlelight. By nightfall, the palace hummed with unease. Servants moved carefully. Nobles stayed close to their chambers. Somewhere, behind locked doors. Cromwell spoke with Fitzwilliam. Letters were sent, orders delivered, and Norris, that same night, was taken to the Tower of London. Though no charges had yet been read aloud, Anne dined alone. Her ladies whispered among themselves. The king did not visit. No message came. The next morning, the 2nd of May, dawned bright and soft. The kind of morning that makes tragedy feel impossible. The sun lit the river. The bells called softly for mass. And Anne, still queen in title, awoke unaware that the day would end with her, standing at the gates of the tower. She dressed with care. Perhaps she chose a darker color, deep wine, or slate gray. Perhaps she wore pearls that once hung around her daughter's wrist. Perhaps she moved more slowly, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing into her chest. Midday brought the council. They summoned her, and when she rose from the tennis match, she had been watching, surrounded by ladies who had gone pale with fear. She walked not toward ceremony, but toward confrontation, the May Day joust, and meant to honor the old rites of fertility and new life, had become the signal flare for a queen's destruction. What should have been a celebration of England's rebirth had instead marked the beginning of Anne's unraveling, and as she was led away, the music of May still played faintly behind her. Now hollow, now mockery. The court had danced, the king had smiled, and the queen, though still crowned, had already been left behind. The tide turned gently that afternoon, silent and silver, as it rolled along the edges of the Thames, brushing the stone walls and worn pilings as it had done for centuries, carrying with it not just the scent of river water and early spring, but the weight of something final, the quiet murmur of history beginning to repeat itself. It was the 2nd of May in the year 1536, and as the great clock above the court struck 2, the barge arrived for Anne Boleyn, not to carry her to triumph, as it once had, but to deliver her to judgment. She had stood on these same steps before 3 years earlier. The river had shimmered in welcome, and the wind had carried songs and cheers, and Anne had stepped onto the barge, wearing a crown and a smile, and the promise of a future no one could take from her. Her coronation procession had glided through the heart of London, past thousands who waved and called her name, past the proud towers of the city that would one day remember her as legend. She had arrived then not as consort, not as mistress, but as queen anointed, triumphant, unshakable. But now, the music was gone. The banners were gone. The only sounds were the steady creak of oars, the rustle of cloaks, and the dull thump of armor at her back. Anne did not speak as she stepped into the barge. Her dress, likely black or deep plum, gathered around her knees as she lowered herself into her seat. Her ladies did not sit beside her. They were not allowed. Her eyes, those eyes once described as black and beautiful, so alive with wit and fire, now watched the riverbank drift away in silence. She passed under London Bridge, past the familiar outline of St. Paul's rising like a ghost against the haze, past the rooftops and chimneys of homes that once whispered her name with reverence. Now, quiet with caution. No one cheered. No one called out. The queen was no longer beloved. She was no longer feared. She was merely being transported, like a relic, or a warning. When the barge reached the Tower of London, it did not dock at Traitor's Gate, the infamous portal reserved for condemned criminals. It docked instead at the court gate of the Byward Tower, more discreet, more royal. A final courtesy, or perhaps a cruel irony. Anne stepped ashore. The stones were slick with river water. Her shoes, fine, and soft, touched the place where so many before her had walked, some to glory, others to death. She paused, just for a breath, just long enough to take in the shape of the archway, the coldness of the walls, the gray sky overhead. And then she turned to Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, and asked the question that would echo through the ages. "Mr. Kingston," she said, her voice clear and trembling, "shall I die without justice, Kingston? Stiff with duty?" We replied that even the poorest subject of the king was granted justice, and Anne, understanding then the fullness of what had happened, of what was still to come, offered the only reply left to her. "The king has been very good to me. He raised me from a simple maid to be a marchioness, then to be a queen. Now, he will raise me to be a martyr." She did not weep. She did not plead. She walked forward, inside, and the apartments were the same as before. Vaulted ceilings, carved wooden panels, deep hearths now, cold with disuse. It was here she had once rested as queen in waiting. It was here she had been adorned before the crown was placed upon her head. The walls remembered, the floors remembered, but this time, the guards did not bow. The doors did not open for ceremony. They closed behind her, with finality. Anne was no longer a guest of the crown. She was a prisoner. Her own belongings were taken from her. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with women she did not know, women instructed not to serve her, but to watch her. Everything she said was reported. Every sigh, every whispered prayer, every sleepless hour. And she did not sleep. That first night, the tower did not offer silence. It offered a hollow wind rattling the old windows, the footsteps of guards echoing in the halls, the faint creak of distant chains, and the sound of her own breathing, shallow and quick, as she lay beneath tapestries that had once warmed her as queen and now felt like burial cloth. She paced. She prayed. At times she laughed strange, sharp laughter that frightened even those sent to spy on her. Other times, she grew silent for hours, her gaze fixed on some invisible point just beyond the wall, as if willing the stones to shift, to open, to undo what had been done. She asked for her daughter, Elizabeth. No one answered. She asked for Henry. No message came. The betrayal settled around her like frost, creeping into the corners of her bones, into the tips of her fingers, into her breath. The man she had loved, the man who had risked a kingdom to possess her, was now the man who had summoned her here to die. There was no comfort in that room. No candle burned long enough. No corner stayed warm. And still, she did not break. She wrote letters, some survived. Some vanished, filled with confusion, with defiance, with sorrow. She spoke often to the women forced to serve her, even knowing they would repeat her words. Sometimes she questioned them. Sometimes she forgave them. Sometimes she seemed to forget they were not friends. Time slowed in the tower. The bells did not ring for her. The days melted into one another like wax, soft and uncertain. Outside, the court moved forward. Inside, Anne waited, and the walls, which had once embraced her as queen, now stood still and watched as her crown dissolved into dust. The morning of the 15th day of May, in the year 1536, dawned with a brightness that felt cruel, as if the sun itself refused to bow its head for the sorrow that would unfold beneath its careless light. And as the mists lifted from the Thames and the ravens wheeled above the tower's ramparts, the great hall at the heart of that ancient fortress was prepared not for celebration, not for a feast or a coronation or the return of a hero, but for a trial that had already been decided. A performance dressed in the language of justice, but hollowed out by betrayal. And into that hall walked a woman who had once been queen, who had once been the embodiment of ambition and grace and flame, and now stood, stripped of her power but not her dignity, surrounded by the cold stone and colder stares of men who would decide whether she lived or died. Though the truth was, they had chosen already. And the rest was only ritual. The space had been rearranged with care, as if ceremony could disguise cruelty. And in the center of it all, on a raised platform, a single chair had been placed for the accused, not hidden, not discreet, but elevated, visible from every angle, so that all who gathered could watch her every breath, every flicker of defiance or fear. And when Anne Boleyn entered, wearing black from head to toe, the hush that fell over the crowd was not reverence but calculation. For the hall was packed with nearly 2,000 spectators, courtiers, nobles, ambassadors, all summoned by curiosity, by allegiance, or by command. And many of them once praised her, once danced in her chambers, once toasted to her health and bowed at her feet. And now they had come to see if her voice would tremble when the sentence was read. Her face, they would say later, was pale but calm, her bearing unshaken, her dark eyes scanning the jury before her. 27 noblemen, each of them sworn to weigh evidence, though they had been gathered not for truth but for obedience. And among them sat her own blood. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, uncle to the woman now on trial, a man chosen to preside over her destruction with the gravity of kinship turned to stone. And though his robes bore the weight of office and his face wore the mask of duty, beneath it, none could say whether he felt guilt or triumph or nothing at all. The charges were read aloud in a voice as steady as it was false, and they hung in the air like smoke. Adultery with multiple men, conspiracy to murder the king, incest with her own brother. The crimes grotesque not only in accusation but in design, crafted to horrify, to shock, to drown sympathy and disgust. And yet as they were spoken, Anne remained still, and when she was permitted to speak in her defense, she rose with the same elegance that once held court beneath gilded ceilings. And she spoke not like a woman begging for her life, but like a queen, unwilling to let the world forget who she had been. Her words, according to those who dared to remember them, were measured and intelligent, challenging the timeline of events with a precision that startled even those who had come to see her fall, pointing out, with quiet clarity, that on the dates she was said to have committed these adulteries, she had either been recovering from childbirth or in locations far removed from the accused, that the men themselves had not been present, that the allegations were not only improbable, but physically impossible. And though the silence in the hall deepened with every contradiction she presented, the faces of the jury did not shift, for it was not evidence they had been gathered to receive. It was closure. No letters were shown. No confessions beyond that of Mark Smeaton, taken under conditions so questionable that even now, centuries later, historians disagree on whether rope or threat or desperation had wrung the words from his mouth. And the testimonies of her own ladies-in-waiting, innocent observations twisted into implications, were offered as proof, though none contained what any true court of law would recognize as guilt. Anne's voice, they said, did not waver, and if her hands trembled, they were clasped too tightly to be seen. And as she spoke of the men condemned alongside her, of Henry Norris, of Sir Francis Weston, of William Brereton, of her own brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, she did not plead innocence for herself alone, but for them, repeating again and again that they had done nothing, that they had served loyally, that their deaths would be unjust if allowed to happen. And in those final arguments, she seemed less concerned for her own life than for the stain that would be left upon theirs. But it made no difference. When her defense concluded, the jury withdrew. But not for long, for there was nothing to deliberate. And within 3 hours, perhaps less, each man returned. Each took his turn to stand. And each pronounced the same word, guilty, one after another. Guilty. Even those who had known her since her youth, even those who had benefited from her rise, even Herr Uncle. And when all had spoken, and the word had been said 27 times, the Duke of Norfolk stood, and with a voice said to be trembling, perhaps from shame, perhaps from performance, he pronounced the sentence written for him before the trial had begun, that Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, should be burned at the stake or beheaded, according to the king's pleasure. And in that moment, when powerlessness finally settled fully upon her shoulders, Anne did not scream, did not collapse, but spoke only this, I am prepared to die. But I am sorry for the poor gentlemen who are to die on my account. They are innocent. And then, her voice breaking for the first time, she added, as for my brother and the others who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them. The crowd did not cheer. The silence that followed was not respectful, but stunned. And as she was led away, she did not cry. She walked not like a criminal, but like someone who had finally understood what could not be undone, and would now face it with what dignity remained. Her uncle sat back down. The jury dispersed. The hall began to empty, but its air remained heavy, as if it, too, had witnessed something it could not cleanse. Justice had not been served that day, but something older, colder, more dangerous had. A king's will, a court's obedience, and a woman's destruction, sealed not by guilt, but by silence. The 17th day of May in the year 1536 dawned over London not with thunder or storm, but with a low gray sky and the kind of stillness that presses itself against the windows and makes people lower their voices without knowing why. A silence that feels too thick for ordinary mornings. A hush that seeps into stone and skin alike. And inside the tower, that stillness hung heavy. For the condemned had risen early, though there was nowhere left to go except forward, toward the place where the axe waited, toward the scaffold raised just beyond the fortress walls, toward the end written for them, not by sin, but by the decisions of a king whose heart had shifted like sand beneath a tide too slow to stop. There were 5 of them. George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, nobleman, tout Cholat, brother to the Queen, the first to be called, and the last to look away from what had been decided, Sir Henry Norris, the king's longtime friend, his servant, his confidant, now branded traitor for standing too close to a woman who had already been judged unworthy of breath, William Brereton, a courtier whose name was known in passing but who now found himself in the center of history not by ambition, but by association, Sir Francis Weston, a man young enough to believe in charm, whose life had moved quickly through dances and tournaments, and now, far too soon, towards execution, and Mark Smeaton, the musician, the commoner, the one whose confession, however taken, had given shape to this horror. The notes of his lute replaced now with the rhythm of footsteps on scaffold planks. They were led out one by one, guarded not fiercely but steadily. The men around them unable to meet their eyes for long. The crowd already gathering, some drawn by duty, others by curiosity, some silent with grief, and some murmuring about justice and sin and treason, though no one could say what truly had been proven. Only what had been pronounced. The scaffold stood at Tower Hill, its frame dark and wet from the morning mist, the axe already in place, the executioner's hands firm on its shaft, his face hidden beneath the cloth of ceremony. And around the base, hay was scattered, not to soften the blow, but to catch the blood. George Boleyn stepped forward first. He was given that final dignity for his rank. A moment to speak before the blade. And what he said has been remembered not for bitterness, but for clarity. For he spoke of God and grace, of repentance and truth. And though he did not confess to the crimes laid upon him, he did not resist the fate arranged for him, for he knew there would be no reversal, no mercy, no royal reprieve racing across the river at the last minute. He knelt. The axe fell. The sound echoed, and in that one moment, something bright and terrible left the air, the certainty that the rest would follow. Sir Henry Norris was next, a man who had once known every secret of the king, who had laughed with him, ridden beside him, prayed with him, and now stood condemned because he had once spoken kindly to the Queen, or perhaps because he had not spoken against her soon enough. And he too was allowed a few words, though he was more cautious than George had been, praising the king, asking for prayers, keeping his sentences brief and careful, as if even at the end he feared that a misstep might cost someone else something more than William Brereton. Quiet, steady, less known, but no less human. His death, no smaller than the others. And when the axe claimed him, the wind shifted slightly, carrying the sound toward the tower where Anne, in her chamber, would hear the muffled thud of cannon fire, signaling that the executions had begun. Sir Francis Weston followed, his face pale but composed, and some say he whispered a prayer to the Virgin before he knelt, though no priest stood beside him. Only a sword of judgment forged from politics and necessity. Last came Mark Smeaton, the youngest, the one whose words had started this march to death, whether spoken by choice or forced by pain. And his eyes, they said, were not filled with fear, but with something deeper, perhaps guilt, perhaps grief, perhaps the knowledge that his name would be remembered not for music, but for confession. He asked for prayers. He did not scream, and when the axe fell for the 5th time that morning, the crowd exhaled as one. Blood had been spilled. The scaffold stood empty. The bodies, wrapped hastily in cloth, were taken away to be buried without ceremony in common graves. And the city, as it always did, continued on. But within the tower, Anne Boleyn stood by her window, her fingers clenched into the stone, her face turned toward the sound of the cannon that had fired 5 times, each one a thunderclap of finality, each one echoing the truth that she already knew. Though her heart had not yet caught up with her mind, her brother was dead. Her friend was dead. The man who had once carried the king's secrets was dead. And still, she remained. 2 more days, 2 more sunrises, 2 more nights with her thoughts, with her prayers, with the slow unraveling of every memory that once held meaning. And still, she waited. That afternoon, a priest arrived, but not with comfort. He came to deliver an annulment signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, the very man who had once stood beside her at the height of her triumph, the man who had declared her queen before God and England, now sent to declare that her marriage had never existed at all. The grounds were vague, perhaps her prior betrothal, perhaps Henry's old affair with her sister Mary Boleyn, perhaps simply the will of the king made paper. But with that parchment, her daughter Elizabeth became illegitimate. With that parchment, the child she had nearly died to bear was no longer in line to rule. With that parchment, Anne Boleyn was no longer wife, no longer queen, only a woman imprisoned and awaiting death for crimes she could not have committed in a marriage that had now been declared fiction. The contradiction was staggering, but the law did not blink, and the king, miles away, did not send word. He had begun preparing a new wedding. He had already given Jane Seymour a ring, and Anne, in her narrow room, pressed her hand to the window pane, watching the light fade from the yard below, wondering whether justice ever had a face or whether it had always worn a mask. She did not cry, or if she did, no one recorded it. She simply stood, waiting, listening, remembering. Until the sword was ready, she rose before the sun. Not because she wished to see it, but because the darkness had grown too heavy, and sleep, that last mercy of the condemned, had finally abandoned her. It was the 19th of May, in the year 1536, and the dawn that crept over the horizon was gentle and pale, the kind of light that might have once filled her with peace. When she was younger, when she believed that love could hold a throne in place, when she believed that Henry's gaze would never grow cold, when she still believed in the safety of being chosen, the room was silent. She dressed in a gown of dark gray or black, simple in cut, without embroidery or jewels, her hair tucked beneath a linen coif, and as she moved, her steps were steady, not with pride, but with the strange grace that often comes to those who have passed beyond fear and into the stillness of acceptance. She spoke softly to her ladies, asked them not to weep, thanked them for their loyalty, and reminded them that she went not as a queen now, but as a soul returning to God, and if any of them still believed in mercy, they should pray not for her survival but for her peace. Outside, in the courtyard, the scaffold had been built on the green, not on Tower Hill, not where the others had died, but within the walls, away from the crowds, by the king's specific command. And in that detail, we see perhaps the last echo of something like tenderness, or perhaps it was shame, or perhaps it was strategy. For even in her death, Anne remained a figure too dangerous to display too publicly, too memorable to be offered to the mob. The sword had been brought from Calais, French, sharp, clean, chosen for mercy, or perhaps for symbolism. For it was France where Anne had learned to speak with wit, to dress with elegance, to move like a woman who knew her worth. And now it was a French blade that would silence her voice forever. They say she walked to the scaffold with calm steps, that she smiled, that she forgave. She looked not at the executioner, but beyond him. She knelt, she asked for prayer, and her final words, whispered for all to hear, I were simple. To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. The sword flashed. The world did not stop. It never does. But something ancient shifted. something terrible was recorded, and the blood that touched the wood that morning would never fully disappear from the memory of England. Anne Boleyn died, with her eyes open, not in terror, not in rage, but in clarity, and for centuries since, we have returned to that image again and again, trying to make sense of how a queen could fall so swiftly, how love could rot so completely, how justice could be twisted into a tool of erasure, and how silence deafening, obedient, necessary silence made it all possible. And in the days and years that followed, her name was dragged through the streets of history. She was called a witch, a séductrice, a traiteur, a whore, and yet, she would not stay buried. Her story surfaced in poems, in paintings, in prayer books passed hand to hand, and then came her daughter, Elizabeth, the girl who had been declared a bastard, who was not supposed to rule, who should have disappeared into the folds of forgotten lineage. But she did not. She rose, and when she did, she carried her mother's eyes. She carried her mother's mind. She carried the weight of every injustice that the Tower had whispered into her childhood. And when she ruled, and she did so for 45 years, as queen, as woman, as symbol, and so Anne, though cut down in silence, it lived again through legacy. But what of the lesson? What do we take with us? As the story closes, as the lights dim, as the lullaby ends, perhaps it is this, that in a world ruled by unchecked power, even love can become a weapon. That justice, when twisted by fear or vanity, is no justice at all. That silence is not always safety, and that a crown, once given, can become a blade. But more than that a woman's voice, even when silenced, I can echo for centuries, and that the ones they tried to erase are often the ones we remember most. So tonight, as you lay your head against the quiet, know that within stone walls and beneath velvet robes, behind tapestries and beneath the floorboards of palaces, stories like Anne's have always waited to be told, not to mourn again, but to remind us that truth, though delayed, does not die. That courage, though punished, leaves a mark. That love, though betrayed, still matters. And that even queens, when left alone in the dark, find a way to rise again and again, not for revenge, not for power, but for remembrance. Good night. Anne, sleep now. We remember, and we will not forget.